Hi everyone, Miss Hart here. Today we're going to be talking about the world in 1750. This is kind of like the first mini unit that we're going to be starting off World History 10 with. If you don't have your notebook to take some notes, go ahead and pause this video for a second. You're definitely going to need to take notes on this. So at this point, we're beginning the second half of a 2-year course on the history of the world. Last year, we ended our study of history around the age of exploration. And this year, we're going to be beginning our study of world history with a brief review of kind of the world as it stands in 1750. One of the ways that we manage studying the entire history of the world in 2 short years is to kind of really approach it in a thematic way, specifically looking through the lens of an enduring issue. An enduring issue is a challenge or problem that society has faced and debated or discussed across time. An enduring issue is one that many societies have attempted to address with varying degrees of success. I would actually pause the video here and write down that definition if you haven't already. One of the enduring issues that we're going to be focusing on in this unit is power. Power is the ability to influence or control the behavior of people and is a part of every human interaction. You can kind of see the effects of power in your relationships with your family and friends, in schools, sports, business, the government. And when the Ottoman Turks kind of like moved into the region when, the Mughals, one of the ways that one of the things that we'll be asking ourselves in this unit is how did kind of France, the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal dynasty, and the Tokugawa Japan gain, consolidate, and maintain their power? The first empire that we're going to be kind of looking at closely is the Ottoman Turks. When the Ottoman Turks moved into the region and established their empire, they used a new technology, gunpowder. It was these famous kind of gunpowder cannons that were used to finally breach the walls of Constantinople in 1453. And ever since then, the Ottomans were building, expanding, and the Ottoman sultans were looking to kind of consolidate their power. One of the ways in which they looked to consolidate their power was by creating new elites, the Difshurmi, that would be completely loyal to the Sultan. In order to ensure their complete loyalty, they were created from the people they were conquered rather than the old nobility, whose ultimate loyalty was their family. So they get rid of the old nobility and create this new one that has sole loyalty to the Sultan. So the Ottoman government basically collected a tax in the form of young Christian boys, primarily from Eastern Europe, who would then be tested for an ability in languages, math, and weapons. Some would serve as bureaucrats working for the government, while others served in the Janissary Corps. And the Janissary Corps, of course, were the famous military corps that allowed the Ottomans to conquer and expand and build their big empire. So thus, we have this new system of elites, these new bureaucrats and military elites who are solely tied to the Sultan, thus kind of consolidating and maintaining his power over his empire. The Ottoman was certainly very much a multicultural and diverse empire, and ruling one of those is not easy. Many leaders throughout history have used religion and culture to unify their people and consolidate their power. This can be problematic in an ethnically diverse empire that makes it a little bit more difficult to unify everyone when there's a lot of ethnic and religious diversity. Many monarchs in the early modern era, like Isabel and Ferdinand of Spain and Louis XIV of France, actually expelled and kicked out any sort of religious minority in order to kind of consolidate their power and unify their people under one religion, the state religion. However, this is not what the Ottomans and the Mughals in India are going to do. The Ottoman Turks and the Mughals in India are actually going to be ruling very diverse empires, and it's not going to go down so well if they start persecuting different religious groups. So they kind of approach things with a very different strategy. The Ottomans, in particular, kind of allowed for religious minorities to kind of do their own thing, in particular Jews and Christians, as long as they paid a tax and were loyal to the Sultan. And if you look closely at this photograph that's taken by a well-known Ottoman photographer, you can kind of see the diversity of the Ottoman Empire. The photograph was commissioned by the Ottoman government for the World's Fair in the late 19th century. The purpose of this photograph was to show the world how diverse the Ottoman Empire was. From right to left, we see a married Muslim woman, a married Jewish woman, and a married Bulgarian woman from Eastern Europe. Now, Mughal India was a little different than the Ottoman Empire. It was also diverse, but the leadership of Mughal India, they were the ones in the minority. The Mughal emperors were Muslim, while the majority of their subjects were Hindu, with large minority groups of Muslims and Sikhs. Persecuting Hindus in this context just isn't smart if you want to stay in power. So as a result, Akbar the Great has to allow the Hindu majority to have leadership positions. He ends the tax on non-Muslim. He even marries a Hindu princess. Now, looking at kind of the European perspective, we also see a lot of these absolute monarchies forming. We see absolute monarchies in the Ottoman Empire. We see absolute monarchies in Mughal India, although he has to be a little bit more decentralized because of the Hindu majority. But we also see this happening in France under Louis XIV, who establishes this absolute monarchy. Louis XIV became king when he was very, very young, but it wasn't until the death of his long-standing chief minister that he really began to rule as an absolute monarch, declaring that he would rule all alone going forward. He viewed himself as the direct representative of God and really used this theory of divine right of kings to legitimize his absolute power. So as an absolute monarch, he makes all the laws, controls all the courts. What he says goes. Where does all this wealth and power come from? Well, it comes from this idea of divine right, but it also comes from all of the gold that France has. France is very wealthy at this time period, primarily from this idea of mercantilism, this economic system where France is trading with its colonies in North America, really getting a lot of wealth from those colonies. And then Louis XIV is going to be using this to fund all of his wars and to basically build France up into this huge power, this very powerful empire in Western Europe and the world. Okay. So I want you to pause for a second and make a prediction. You can write this down in your notebook. What do you think the long-term impact of Louis XIV's absolutism might be? Well, I'll be interested to kind of hear your thoughts on that when we get back in class. Now I want to take a look at Japan, and Japan under during the Tokugawa era. Japan during this time period in 1750 is in its feudal period. Okay. So even though there is an emperor in Japan at this time, the emperor is just a figurehead. The real power is with the shogun, who is the kind of military leader. Okay? And under the shogun are kind of like these lords, the daimyo. This is kind of similar to European feudalism. And there were strict rules that guided kind of like military households in Japan under the Tokugawa era. For example, the Tokugawa shogunate required daimyo lords to leave hostages with them in order to ensure their good behavior. They weren't allowed to build large castles so that they could hole up in and protect themselves from the shogun. They really kind of were exiling anyone who opposes them. They really created systems that prevented those daimyo lords from challenging the power of the shogun. They even had a relay system of communication, and you weren't allowed to travel on these roads after kind of sunset unless you had a pass from the shogun. So, this is not just about communication, this is about controlling and maintaining their power. Now, if we're looking at Louis XIV of France and Tokugawa Japan, they're both maintaining control of their people, but in very, very different ways. One way is by focusing on the importance of cities. We've got Paris and Versailles in France, and we've got Edo in Japan. Louis XIV rules from his palace Versailles, which he built for him outside of Paris in order to kind of protect himself and provide a nice little buffer from the masses in Paris. And the Tokugawa shogun is living and ruling from Edo, Japan. Both of these leaders really limited the power of the nobility. The daimyo lords were forced to reside at the shogun's castle for half of the year, and then when they returned home, they had to leave a family member behind as a hostage to ensure their good behavior. Basically, by force, ensuring their loyalty to the shogun, thus maintaining his power over them. And it was very similar in France under Louis XIV. Nobles were forced to attend Louis XIV at Versailles Palace. This whole idea of keep your friends close and keep your enemies closer. Both the shogun in Japan and King Louis XIV kept a close eye on their nobles, keeping them near them physically in Versailles, in Edo, in order to keep an eye on them. Again, this is about power. This is about control. Okay, so take a second in your notes, pause this video, and I want you to reflect on what we just talked about and answer this question. Okay, we'll take a look and circle back around to that in class. Just make sure that this is a way of kind of you showing me that you kind of understood this lecture. The last thing that we want to compare is really the Tokugawa shogunate and the Mughal Empire's response to outsiders. Because unlike the last comparison, this one is showing a strong difference. Okay, in terms of the Tokugawa shogunate, they really had a big issue with outsiders. They saw all of the Christian missionaries that were coming in as a challenge to kind of Japanese traditions. They didn't like the conversions to Christianity, and they really saw it as a threat to their power. So as a result, Christianity is banned under the Tokugawa shogunate, and in the early 17th century, they actually closed Japan to all outside trade. So when you kind of think about the Tokugawa shogunate, don't just think of kind of the way he controlled his nobles. I also want you to remember that he isolated, and that family isolated Japan in order to prevent the cultural diffusion. Japan is closing itself off to the outside world in order to protect itself and really to protect the power of the ruling family. Okay, so in 1635, the shogun, issues this edict ordering the closing of Japan. That's kind of important to remember. Okay, the Mughals have a very different response. Missionaries were kind of welcomed in the court of Akbar the Great. Remember, the Mughal emperors are Muslim, but they have a Hindu majority, so they have to be a lot more tolerant. Europeans were a very common sight in Mughal India by the 17th and 18th centuries. So they just have a very different response, one of tolerance and kind of trade and acceptance, whereas the Tokugawa period is marked by kind of closing themselves off. No foreigners, stay away. Okay. So in conclusion, I just want you to think about what is happening in the world in 1750. We see the development of a lot of kind of absolute type monarchies where we have single rulers ruling large empires like in France and the Ottoman Empire, that have a large amount of power. We also see a world of increasing global trade and a real desire for Europeans to trade with Asia. We also see this as the beginning of an era of new technology and innovations. And all of this is going to really set the stage for some of the major changes that are going to be happening in the first semester and that we're going to be going over. These new global trade networks, the technological innovations, these are the things that are the context for the age of revolutions, industrialization, and really the beginning of the second wave of European imperialism, all of which we'll be studying in the first portion of our class this year. That's about all I have for you today. Please make sure you let me know if you have any questions on this video lecture. And also, we're going to go over the answer to your questions at the beginning of class tomorrow. See you later. Ms. Hart.